from chasing down runaway slaves, to stealing millions from wounded veterans, to doing nothing while the nation burned. These are the 10 worst presidents in American history. The ones they'd rather you forget.
But first is Benjamin Harrison, a president most people forget even existed. He wasn't famous, but he left a huge mark, mainly by wrecking the economy and then vanishing before he could take the blame. In 1890, Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff. It raised taxes on imports to nearly 50%. The idea was simple: protect American businesses. But what actually happened? Prices skyrocketed, foreign trade collapsed, and farmers got absolutely crushed. As if that wasn't enough, he burned through the entire federal surplus, like a kid spending his first paycheck. And the worst part? None of it came crashing down until after he left office. The Panic of 1893 hit hard, one of the worst depressions in U.S. history. President Grover Cleveland was left to clean up the mess, while Harrison was long gone, back home in Indiana, writing books, pretending like nothing ever happened. So no, Benjamin Harrison didn't start wars or commit crimes. He just played Jenga with the economy and walked away as it collapsed.
But none of that was as bad as Millard Fillmore, who turned every citizen into a slave hunter. Because in 1850, the nation was divided over slavery. The South was loving it, the North not so much. But the South was threatening to secede. So in an effort to compromise and preserve the Union, Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act, legally requiring every U.S. citizen to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. In other words, if a slave showed up on your doorstep and you offered them a glass of water, it could land you in prison, even if you lived in a free state. That's nuts! But as you may have guessed, this backfired, because normal people who never cared about slavery were suddenly like, wait, what? With abolitionist movements growing overnight and more normies becoming radicalized by the day. So, while Fillmore thought he was keeping the peace, he ended up pouring fuel on the fire, pushing the nation one step closer towards civil war.
But that's not as embarrassing as this next president, William Henry Harrison, who holds the record for the shortest presidency in American history. Because in 1841, Harrison was 68 years old, one of the oldest presidents elected at the time. So to prove he still had energy for the job, he delivered the longest inauguration speech ever recorded, nearly 2 hours long. Man's out here with no coat, no hat, and no common sense. The old man just wanted to prove he still had it. A lot like your grandpa trying to do a kickflip on your skateboard. But a few weeks later, he came down with a bad cold that turned into pneumonia. For most of history, we thought it came from his crazy speech in the rain. But modern historians believe it was more likely typhoid from contaminated drinking water at the White House. Either way, 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison was dead. He didn't sign a single law or make one decision. Instead, he spent more time writing an inauguration speech than being an actual president. And to make matters worse, he triggered a constitutional crisis. Because at the time, nobody knew what happens after a president dies in office. It wasn't 100% clear if the vice president simply acted as president or became president outright. Thankfully, John Tyler stepped up and said, "I'm president now." And everyone just kind of went along with it. But what was William Henry Harrison's legacy? No scandals, no war, no nothing. Just one epic speech and a short stay at the White House. If there were a Hall of Fame for how to completely blow a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Harrison would be a first ballot member.
But at least he didn't, completely destroy America, like Franklin Pierce, who, well, came pretty dang close. Because with his movie star good looks and smooth-talking speeches, Pierce became elected to deal with the whole slavery problem. But he quickly made one giant mistake: the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. You see, back then, there was a bunch of unorganized land after the Louisiana Purchase. State lines were still being drawn, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act established the areas as U.S. territories. But it also stated that popular sovereignty would determine if slavery was allowed in each territory. In other words, the new settlers would vote on it, reversing the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery above a certain line. So, what was the result? Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded Kansas with rifles, torches, and angry mobs. The territory quickly descended into chaos and bloodshed. Houses were burned, families slaughtered, and the 5-year bloodbath was nicknamed Bleeding Kansas. So, what did Franklin Pierce do to stop it? Pretty much nothing. In fact, he backed the pro-slavery side, which formed an illegitimate government through voter fraud and violence. He even sent in federal troops to stabilize the new government. Pretty crazy times, because instead of calming tensions between the North and South, Pierce accelerated the nation's march towards civil war.
But this next terrible president is one you might not expect: Woodrow Wilson. He's known for his lofty ideals, like championing the League of Nations and making the world safe for democracy. And hey, he did some pretty good stuff, like leading the US through World War I. But here's the problem. Back at home, he launched some of the worst attacks on American freedoms in US history. During World War I, he signed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the flag. And hey, I love America as much as the next guy, but this was downright crazy. Because under his administration, over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted. Journalists, union leaders, and regular citizens who dared to speak their minds. Free speech, the bedrock of American democracy, was crushed under the weight of wartime paranoia. But Wilson thought it was totally worth it. Because after World War I, he pushed for the League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization designed to keep world peace. But there was one tiny problem. The U.S. Senate rejected it, afraid it would drag America into European wars. Wilson couldn't believe it. But here's the funny part. The League of Nations still happened with 63 other countries, just without the U.S. So Wilson was left crying outside the club. And to top it all off, he punished Germany so harshly with the Treaty of Versailles that it basically planted the seeds for World War II. In the end, Wilson became a prisoner of his own ego. A man so obsessed with his vision, he refused to bend, causing chaos at home and abroad.
And Wilson's presidency had some eerily similar vibes to this next guy, George W. Bush. He walked into the White House with a handshake and a smirk, until history hit him with every disaster short of a meteor strike. First, 9/11. And to his credit, Bush brought the country together for about 6 months. But what came next reshaped the entire world, and not exactly for the better. He decided to invade Iraq based on bad intel that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Turns out, he didn't. But by then, America was locked in a $1 trillion war that took over 4,400 American lives, wounded tens of thousands, and left the Middle East in chaos for decades. Thanks for your service. And like Woodrow Wilson, Bush also gutted civil liberties at home. He passed the Patriot Act in October 2001, giving the government massive new surveillance powers. The NSA and FBI could spy on Americans without a warrant. Hey, is this thing recording me? Now, sure, you could argue it was necessary back then, but many of those powers still exist today. Pretty sure the Founding Fathers wouldn't love that surveillance state idea. Then came Hurricane Katrina. The levees broke, New Orleans flooded, and the government's response was, basically, "We're working on it." People were stranded on rooftops, while the Superdome became a shelter of last resort. 30,000 people packed inside, the roof leaking, power out, toilets overflowing. It was chaos. The whole thing became a symbol of government failure, and Bush was the face of it. So yeah, George W. Bush didn't just mess things up back then. Americans are still living with the consequences today.
But speaking of messing stuff up, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, America needed a steady hand to unite the country. Instead, it got Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder from Tennessee who, believe it or not, didn't exactly believe in racial equality. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would have granted citizenship and basic rights to formerly enslaved people. Things like the right to make contracts, own property, and be treated equally under the law. What the heck, man? But Congress wasn't having it. They overrode his veto and pushed through the 14th Amendment, locking those rights into the Constitution. But Johnson didn't back down. He found other ways to prop up the South, like issuing mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederates. Because it's kind of a big deal when you take up arms against the United States. Most governments would throw you in jail or hang you for treason. But Johnson restored their rights and let them retake power in the South. His logic? We shouldn't kick the losers while they're down. But as you might have guessed, his plan backfired. It started the Jim Crow era, gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan, and stoked racial tensions across the nation. In Congress's eyes, Johnson had basically undone the point of winning the Civil War. So they impeached him, the first presidential impeachment in U.S. history. Johnson faced trial in the Senate and survived conviction by just one vote. Whew, that was close. Post-Civil War America was chaos. We needed a leader to rise above the hate and pull the country forward. Instead, Johnson doubled down on division.